A Sketch of Hope, a short story by Finn Wilder. The teahouse bustled with the evening rush, the air thick with the scent of steeped leaves and the low hum of conversation. Rin weaved through the narrow spaces between tables, his movements fluid, almost weightless. A tray balanced effortlessly in his hands, cups of steaming tea nestled perfectly in place, despite the constant jostling around him. A customer shifted their chair back suddenly, blocking his path. Without hesitation, Rin adjusted, pivoting gracefully on the balls of his feet, tail flicking instinctively to counterbalance. Not a single drop spilled. He murmured a soft, automatic apology, even though he wasn't at fault, and continued on his way. Most wouldn't notice anything unusual about him at first glance. He was small, slender, and unassuming, a quiet presence in the room. But the large black feline furred ears atop his head, flicking slightly at the constant noise, marked him as different. That, and the tail swaying behind him, betraying the emotions he kept hidden from his face. For Rin was a Neko. Though his kind weren't common, they weren't unheard of either. Many found them endearing, treating them with a fascinated kind of affection. Others saw them as something lesser. "You're always so light on your feet," a middle-aged woman said as he set down her tea. She smiled warmly. "Would it be all right if I petted your ears?" Rin's ears twitched at the request, but he smiled and nodded, lowering his head slightly to let her gently brush her fingers over the soft fur triangles atop his head. He didn't mind, in fact. He rather enjoyed it, found it quite soothing. It was a common enough request, and in his eyes one of the nicer parts of his job. Not everyone was so kind. "Oi, cat boy," a gruff voice called from the other side of the room. "I've been waiting forever. You deaf under those ears?" Rin flinched, but quickly schooled his expression into one of quiet submission. He hurried over, bowing slightly as he placed the man's drink down. "Sorry for the wait." The man scoffed, snatching up the cup. "Useless." Rin said nothing. He never did. He had long since learned that silence was safer. As he stepped away, he caught sight of his boss, Mr. Tano, lingering near the counter, his sharp gaze tracking Rin's every move. Rin knew what that meant. At the end of the shift, there would be some excuse to dock his pay, a minor mistake, an unfounded complaint, or simply the fact that Tano felt like it. Still, he kept moving, weaving between tables, serving tea, nodding politely, enduring it all with quiet grace in a delicate balance, a routine he had perfected. This was his life. By the time Rin stepped out of the teahouse, the city night had settled in. The streets bathed in the dull glow of flickering lanterns and neon signs. The buzz of conversation and clinking cups faded behind him, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional murmur of passing strangers. He pulled his thin jacket tighter around himself, ears twitching at the cool night air, and set off toward home. His lodging was nothing special, a single rented room in a building packed tightly with others just like it. The walls were thin, the wooden floorboards scuffed and worn by years of footsteps, and the window barely large enough to let in what little light the city had to offer. It wasn't much, but it was what he could afford. He placed his small bag on the floor and let out a breath, taking a moment to enjoy the silence. No customers calling out for him, no sharp-eyed boss watching his every move. Just quiet. Crossing to the small desk tucked in the corner, he reached for his sketchbook. running his fingers over its worn cover before flipping it open. The pages inside were filled with images drawn in soft, careful strokes. Places he had never been, landscapes untouched by the weight of the city, rolling green hills, quiet lakes under starlit skies, tiny cottages nestled among trees, worlds he had only seen in his mind, places he wished were real. But it wasn't just landscapes. Scattered among the pages were moments, small, quiet scenes of the kind of world he wished existed. A child laughing as someone lifted them into the air, a person offering another a flower, two people sitting close, their hands nearly touching but not quite. A stranger passing an umbrella to someone caught in the rain. Little things, simple things, the kind of kindness that felt rare in the world he knew. Rin traced his fingertips lightly over the pages, his ears twitching slightly. His sketchbook wasn't just a collection of drawings. It was a collection of his dreams and hopes. He picked up a pencil and let it glide across the page, adding the curve of a stone bridge over a slow-moving river. Drawing was his one escape, his one quiet joy, in a life that often felt like it belonged to someone else. Here he could create a world where he belonged. The dim bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the room. Rin sighed and set his pencil down. It was late, and morning would come too soon. He curled up beneath the thin blanket on his small bed, tail wrapping loosely around his legs. Another day was over. Tomorrow would be the same as today. Or so he thought. Morning came too soon, as it always did. Rin stepped into the teahouse just as the first customers were trickling in, the air already warming with the scent of steeping tea. The routine was the same: take orders, serve drinks, avoid trouble. But today, something was different. He caught the first sign of it as he stepped behind the counter to grab a tray. Mr. Tano was there, speaking in his usual gruff, impatient tone, but not to him. Another voice answered, a human voice, deeper, rough around the edges. Rin turned his head slightly, ears twitching toward the conversation. "Just don't give me any attitude and you'll keep the job," Tano was saying. The new hire. Rin hadn't been told they were getting one, but he wasn't surprised. Turnover was high here. A moment later, the stranger stepped past the counter, and Rin got his first look at him. He was tall, easily a head taller than Rin, with dark hair that looked like it had been hastily combed into something halfway respectable. His sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and there was an air of casual disregard in the way he carried himself. He looked rough. Not like the usual polished city workers who drifted in and out of this place. Their eyes met for only a second. Jiro's gaze flicked to Rin's ears, then to his tail, and something in his expression shifted. Rin had seen that look before. Not curiosity, not fascination. Contempt. Jiro scoffed under his breath and moved past him without a word. Rin lowered his gaze and got back to work. At first, Jiro ignored him. He was too busy getting used to the job, making careless mistakes, grumbling when Mr. Tano barked at him. But it didn't take long. By midday, the small slights began, standing just a little too close behind Rin when he reached for something, forcing him to step aside, bumping into him and muttering an insincere whoops. Small things. Petty things. Rin said nothing. He never did. Then, when the lunch rush hit, Jiro escalated. Rin had just placed a full tray of drinks onto the counter when Jiro reached for a cup. Too fast, too careless. The tray tilted. The cups wobbled. Rin reacted instantly, catching the edge and steadying it before disaster struck. Jiro leaned in. "Not bad, Cat. Quick reflexes." His voice was light, amused. Rin didn't answer. Jiro smirked and took the cup, sauntering off to his table. Mr. Tano, watching from across the room, scowled. "Careful with those trays, Cat," he snapped. "You break anything, it's coming out of your pay." Rin swallowed back a protest. It wasn't his fault, but he already knew how this worked. Tano would never side with him over a human. Jiro glanced back at him as he set the drink down, and for just a second, there was something in his expression, something knowing. He did that on purpose. Rin tightened his grip on the tray and turned away. This was only the first day. It was going to get worse. Days passed, then a week. Jiro settled into the job, growing more confident, more comfortable. And with that comfort came cruelty. At first it was small things, stealing tips before Rin could collect them, muttering insults under his breath whenever he passed by. But as the days wore on, Jiro grew bolder. One afternoon, as Rin was wiping down a table, he felt a sharp tug at his tail. He yelped in pain and his whole body jerked, ears flattening as he stumbled forward, barely catching himself before he knocked over a chair. A low chuckle followed. "Didn't know you'd react like that," Jiro mused, leaning lazily against the counter. "Sensitive, huh?" Rin's tail curled tightly behind him. He didn't answer, didn't even look up. Jiro clicked his tongue. "Man, you're no fun." Then, as if he hadn't just yanked Rin's tail like a child playing with a toy, he strolled off to the kitchen. Rin exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to stay steady as he picked up the cloth again. It didn't stop there. Another time, Rin reached for his sketchbook during a quiet moment between shifts, flipping to a half-finished drawing of a countryside village. He barely had time to set pencil to paper before the book was snatched from his hands. Jiro held it just out of reach, flipping through the pages with an exaggerated hum. "Didn't take you for the artsy type." "Give it back." Rin kept his voice calm, but inside, a quiet panic stirred. Jiro grinned, holding the book higher. "What, you don't want me to see? What's this supposed to be, some fantasy town you wish you could run away to?" He snorted, turning another page. "Man, you really are pathetic." Rin's fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he stayed still. After a few more taunts, Jiro finally tossed the sketchbook back onto the table. "Don't waste too much time dreaming, Cat. This is the real world." Rin swallowed hard, smoothing his hands over the bent pages. His world was small. There was no escape from this, no safety net. He had to endure it, just like he endured everything else. And so he did. But deep down, something in his chest ached for something better. The teahouse had started to quiet down for the evening, the dinner rush fading into a slow trickle of lingering customers. Rin worked in silence, clearing tables, wiping down surfaces, slipping between chairs with practiced ease. Then the front door slammed open. The force of it rattled the walls, sending a sharp crack through the room. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Rin glanced up, and the moment he did, something in his chest tightened. A tall man strode inside, his heavy steps making the wooden floor creak beneath his polished shoes. His presence alone carried weight, like he expected the room to adjust around him. Sharp suit, dark eyes filled with nothing but cold judgment, his expression carved from stone. But it wasn't his presence alone that sent an instinctive chill through Rin. It was the way Jiro froze. Rin had never seen him hesitate before. Jiro was all smirks and swagger, always acting like he owned the space he stood in. But now, for the first time, he didn't move. His face had gone stiff, his hands clenching so tightly at his sides that his knuckles turned white. The man crossed the room in a few long strides, grabbed Jiro by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The shelves behind them rattled, a teacup toppling over and shattering against the floor. The entire room went silent. "You really thought you could get away with it?" the man growled, his voice low and venomous. Jiro gritted his teeth, fingers gripping at the wrist that held him pinned, but he didn't fight back. He barely moved. The man's grip tightened. "You stole from me." The words were like iron, not the rage of a father who cared, but the fury of a man who had been defied. "You really think you can make it on your own?" He leaned in, voice dropping lower. "You're nothing without me. You hear me? A goddamn nobody. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away." Jiro's jaw clenched, his breathing shallow. He wasn't looking at his father anymore. His gaze was on the floor, on nothing. Rin felt frozen. His tail was curled tightly behind him, his ears flattened against his head. His mind screamed at him to do something. But what? He was too small, too weak. If he tried to intervene, he'd just be thrown aside. The man noticed Rin's stare, his cold gaze flicking towards him, his lip curling in distaste. "What are you staring at, cat boy?" he snapped. "Get lost. This is a private conversation between a father and his good-for-nothing son." Rin swallowed hard but didn't argue. He couldn't. The man turned his attention back to Jiro, his grip finally loosening, but only so he could shove him down. Jiro hit the ground hard, his palms catching him at the last second. He didn't get up. He just stayed there, his breath shallow, his eyes hidden beneath the dark strands of hair falling over his face. His father adjusted his sleeves, as if even touching Jiro had been an inconvenience. He exhaled sharply, then muttered, "Go ahead, struggle, crawl through the dirt with the rest of the trash. But don't think for a second you'll ever be worth a damn." And then, just like that, he turned and walked out. The door swung shut behind him. Silence lingered. No one moved. No one spoke. The few customers still inside kept their heads down, pretending they hadn't just witnessed what had happened. Jiro stayed on the ground for a long moment. His shoulders were stiff, his hands braced against the floor. Rin could see the tension in his fingers, the way they trembled, so slight it was almost imperceptible. But it was there. Then, with a sharp breath, Jiro forced himself up. He didn't look at Rin, didn't look at anyone. Without a word, he turned and strode toward the back, disappearing through the kitchen doors. Rin watched him go, his tail flicking uncertainly behind him. For the first time since meeting Jiro, he didn't feel anger toward him. He felt something else entirely. Jiro didn't show up for work the next morning. It wasn't like Rin missed him. If anything, the teahouse felt quieter without Jiro's usual snide remarks and casual shoves. No stolen tips, no muttered insults, and yet something felt off. Mr. Tano barely seemed to care. When the lunch rush hit, he grumbled about being short-staffed, but that was the extent of his concern. Jiro's absence wasn't important enough to warrant any further thought. But Rin thought about it. He thought about it when he balanced trays, ears twitching at every noise near the door, expecting to hear Jiro's voice. He thought about it when he passed by the wall where Jiro had been slammed the night before, the memory still fresh in his mind. When Jiro finally showed up the next day, he wasn't the same. He walked in late, his usual swagger absent, dark circles under his eyes. He didn't acknowledge Rin, didn't even glance at him. He just grabbed an apron and got to work. Rin didn't know what he had expected. Maybe another sneer, another shove in passing, something to signal that things hadn't changed. But Jiro didn't say a word. He moved through the shift like a shadow, sluggish, distracted. His hands trembled slightly when he carried trays, his usual sharp remarks absent. When Mr. Tano snapped at him for moving too slow, he didn't bite back. He just nodded stiffly and kept going. It wasn't restraint. It wasn't guilt. It was like he wasn't even there. Like something inside him had been stripped away, leaving only this empty, mechanical version of the person he used to be. And somehow, that was worse. At first he kept his distance. But as the day went on, the silence between them became something Jiro couldn't seem to tolerate. And just like that, the hostility returned. "Move," he muttered, bumping into Rin on purpose as he passed by. Not hard, not even enough to knock him off balance, but just enough to remind him that things weren't different. But Rin had seen what he'd seen. And no matter how much Jiro tried to act normal, no matter how sharp his words were, he wasn't fooling anyone. One afternoon, during his tea break, Rin lingered near the counter, quietly sketching in his book. It was a small moment of peace, a routine he clung to before the start of the evening rush. Jiro walked by, pausing just long enough to glance over. "Still drawing those little fairy tale towns?" he muttered. His voice didn't have the same bite as before, but the words were still there, automatic. Rin didn't answer. Jiro scoffed and turned away. "What a joke." Rin closed his sketchbook, tucking it under his arm. He could have ignored the comment like he always did, but something about tonight felt different, and before he could stop himself, the words slipped out. "Does it make you feel better?" Jiro stopped mid-step. Rin's ears lowered slightly, but he didn't look away. His voice was quiet, steady. "Talking to me like that, does it actually help?" Jiro turned, something unreadable flickering across his face. "What?" Rin just looked at him. Not challenging, not mocking, just watching. Waiting. Jiro stared back, his jaw tight. For the first time, he didn't have an immediate comeback. Then, with a sharp breath, he tore off his apron and tossed it onto the counter. "I don't owe you an explanation, cat," he snapped as he stormed off through the kitchen door into the back of the shop. For 2 days, Jiro had barely spoken a word to Rin. The usual taunts were gone, the careless shoves and muttered insults absent. At first, Rin thought maybe it was over, that Jiro had finally grown bored of tormenting him. But the silence wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It felt hollow. Jiro wasn't ignoring him. He was falling apart. The usual arrogance in his movements had vanished, replaced with something sluggish and distracted. He flinched at raised voices. His hands trembled slightly when he carried trays, and when Mr. Tano snapped at him for breaking a plate, Jiro simply stood there, staring at the shattered pieces on the floor as if he wasn't really seeing them at all. Then he turned and walked away without a word. Rin watched him go, a quiet unease settling in his chest. That night, everything changed. The shift had ended, and Rin stepped out into the cold air, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as he stepped onto the quiet street. The teahouse door clicked shut behind him. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath curl in the chilly night air. Then he saw him. Jiro stood motionless at the curb, his back to Rin, shoulders tense. The distant rumble of an approaching truck echoed through the street. Its headlights cast long shadows against the pavement, growing brighter as it neared. Jiro didn't move. He wasn't paying attention. Then, in his absent-minded state, he began to step out into the road. Rin barely had time to think. His body acted on instinct, his feet barely touching the ground as he lunged forward, grabbing Jiro's arm and yanking him back just as the truck roared past. The rush of air whipped against them, the sound deafening, and for a brief moment everything was a blur of flashing lights and movement. Then silence. Jiro was stiff beneath Rin's grasp, his breath sharp and uneven. He hadn't even braced himself, as if he hadn't realized what had just happened until it was over. Then suddenly he shoved Rin back. Not hard, but enough to break the contact between them. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Jiro snapped, his voice rough, unsteady. Rin's tail curled slightly behind him, his ears flattening at the sharpness in his tone, but he didn't look away. His voice was quiet, steady. "You almost died." Jiro let out a sharp breath, dragging a hand through his hair. "Shh, I wasn't." He stopped, swallowed thickly, and looked away. He couldn't even finish the lie. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sounds of the city drifted around them, distant and unfocused, but in the space between them there was only the weight of something unspoken. Then, without another word, Jiro turned and walked away. Rin stood silently, watching his retreating figure disappear down the dimly lit street, his ears twitching at the faint sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Jiro didn't show up the next morning. Or the next. By the third day, Mr. Tano had already begun muttering about hiring someone else, his tone indifferent. If Jiro never came back, it was clear no one would care. Except, maybe, Rin did, and he didn't know why. But on the fourth day, Jiro returned. He walked in just before the lunch rush, his movements stiff, his usual arrogance missing. There were no cocky remarks, no lazy smirk. He didn't even look at Rin, just grabbed an apron and started working like nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Jiro wasn't cruel anymore. He wasn't mocking, wasn't sharp-edged. But he wasn't quite right either. He spoke only when necessary, his presence reduced to something small, careful, almost hesitant. And for the first time since they had met, he didn't touch Rin's tips. The first time it happened, Rin thought maybe Jiro just hadn't noticed them. But then it happened again. And again. It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. Later that evening, as the last customers trickled out and they worked in silence, Jiro finally spoke. "Do you ever get sick of it?" Rin glanced up, ears twitching slightly. "Sick of what?" Jiro exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "All of it. The way people treat you, how they look at you. Don't you ever get tired of it?" Rin thought for a moment, then shrugged slightly. "What would be the point?" Jiro frowned. "What do you mean?" "Well, I mean, it wouldn't change anything." Rin set down the last clean cup, stacking it neatly. "So why waste the energy?" Jiro scoffed under his breath. "That's messed up." Rin tilted his head slightly. "Is it?" Jiro didn't answer. He just looked at him, something heavy in his expression. Then he turned away. He didn't push Rin that night, didn't mutter some last-minute insult to restore the balance between them. He just stood there, his grip tightening slightly on the counter. Then, as he turned to leave, He paused. I didn't mean what I said before. His voice was quieter now, rough, like it hurt to say it. Rin blinked, ears flicking forward slightly. Before? Jiro's fingers curled into a fist at his side. All the things I said to you. I didn't mean them. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply, turning his head away. Not all of them, anyway. Rin watched him for a long moment. He didn't know what he had expected from Jiro after what had happened. But it hadn't been this. Jiro didn't wait for a response. He just exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck before muttering, "Forget it." Then he turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Rin stayed where he was, his tail curling slightly behind him. Jiro's words hadn't been much, barely even an apology, but for someone like him it was a start. The shift in Jiro's behaviour wasn't instant. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The hostility had faded, not replaced by kindness exactly, but by something quieter. Hesitation, restraint, like he wasn't sure how to act anymore. But Rin noticed something else. Jiro was trying. It was in the way he no longer took from Rin's tips, passing by the small coins left on Rin's tables without a second glance. It was in the way he corrected customers, not Rin, when orders got mixed up. The way he picked up extra work when the kitchen was overwhelmed, his usual laziness replaced with a quiet determination to pull his weight. And then there was the moment that stopped Rin in his tracks. It was late, the tea house empty except for the two of them. Rin had finished counting his tips for the day, neatly stacking them on the counter before wiping down the surface. He turned away for only a second, just enough to rinse out the cloth. When he came back, there were more coins. Not much. Just a little extra. Rin stilled, his tail flicking slightly. His ears twitched toward the only other person in the room. Jiro stood near the doorway, untying his apron. He didn't look at Rin, didn't say a word. Rin glanced at the coins again. He could have questioned it, could have asked why. But instead, he let the moment pass. Because whatever this was, whatever strange, quiet thing was shifting, Jiro wasn't ready to talk about it. The next day, the tea house had settled into its usual afternoon lull. The rush had passed, leaving only a handful of quiet patrons sipping their drinks, the hum of conversation a low backdrop to the clink of cups. Rin was behind the counter, restocking trays, his bag and keys tucked beneath the shelf where the staff kept their things. His sketchbook was there too, left absent-mindedly beside them. He hadn't thought much of it. He had simply set it down when the lunch rush started, intending to pick it up later on his break. He hadn't expected Jiro to notice it, or to reach for it, but he did. Jiro had come behind the counter for something else, a clean towel maybe, but when his eyes landed on the sketchbook, he hesitated. Rin was in the kitchen out of sight, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, Jiro picked it up. He flipped it open, and froze. Page after page of delicate, detailed sketches filled the book. Landscapes that felt alive. Scenes that looked as if they had been carefully pulled from someone's deepest longing. Jiro stared, his fingers hovering over the edges of the pages. He had mocked Rin for this before, called it pathetic, childish. But now, he saw it for what it was. It was incredible. His throat felt tight as he turned another page. And then, his stomach twisted. It was him. A drawing of himself, sitting on the worn wooden steps of a house. Not the tea house, but somewhere warm, somewhere safe. His posture was relaxed, his expression smiling and calm, in a way Rin had never seen before. And beside him, his father, not angry, not controlling, but hugging him. Jiro's fingers trembled against the paper. His breath came in short, uneven pulls. This had never happened. Not once. Not in his childhood. Not in his entire life. And yet, Rin had drawn it. Not as a joke. Not as mockery. But as if it was something real. As if it was something that could have been. A quiet, ragged noise caught in Jiro's throat. Half a breath. Half something closer to a sob. His grip on the sketchbook tightened. His chest ached in a way that felt unbearable. He shut the book quickly and shoved it back where he had found it, his pulse hammering in his ears. He needed to leave. Now. Without thinking, without looking back, Jiro stormed out. The door swung shut behind him. Rin returned a few moments later, towel in hand, ears twitching at the faint sound of the door closing. He frowned slightly, glancing toward the counter. Then, noticing nothing out of place, he simply got back to work, completely unaware of what had just happened. Jiro didn't come back for the rest of the afternoon, or the evening. By the next day, Rin assumed he wasn't coming back at all. Mr. Tano muttered about unreliable workers, but made no real effort to find out where Jiro had gone. The teahouse ran without him. The world moved on. But then, just before noon, Jiro walked through the door. He looked like hell. His eyes were bloodshot, his posture stiff, like he hadn't slept, or maybe like sleep had refused to take him. He didn't say a word. Just grabbed an apron and started working. But Rin knew. Something inside Jiro had shattered, and he was holding the broken pieces together with sheer force of will. More than that, he wouldn't look at Rin. Not once. The weight of it sat between them all morning, thick and suffocating. Rin didn't push, didn't ask, but he could feel something pressing in on Jiro, crushing him from the inside. Then, as they were cleaning up after the lunch rush, he broke. "Did you mean it?" His voice was rough, unsteady, like he had been holding the words back all day. Rin looked up. "Mean what?" Jiro exhaled sharply, gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping him standing. "The drawing." Rin stilled. His tail curled slightly behind him. "You looked through my sketchbook." Jiro let out a short, breathless laugh, one with no humour at all. "Yeah, I did." For the first time, he looked at Rin. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression a mess of something Rin couldn't quite name. He shook his head, jaw clenched. "I don't get it. Why the hell would you draw that?" Rin hesitated, then answered simply, "Because that's what I dream about." Jiro sucked in a breath, sharp and uneven. Rin glanced down, fingers brushing the worn edge of the counter. "It's just my sketchbook. It's where I draw the things I wish for, hope for." A soft, almost shy smile tugged at his lips. "I guess you could say it's a sketchbook of my dreams." Jiro's throat worked, like he wanted to speak but couldn't. His hands clenched at his sides, shoulders shaking just slightly. He turned his head away, but not fast enough. Rin saw the tears. Jiro gritted his teeth, inhaling sharply, his whole body trembling like he was fighting something back with everything he had. But it was no use. His breath hitched. His fingers curled against the counter, knuckles turning white. And then he broke. A sharp, choked noise slipped from his throat, too raw to be held back. He pressed the heel of his palm hard against his eyes, his shoulders shaking. "God," he whispered. "God, what the hell is wrong with you?" Rin's ears twitched slightly. "What?" Jiro let out a ragged, broken laugh. "You shouldn't." His voice cracked. He dropped his hand, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. "You shouldn't be like this. You shouldn't—" His hands clenched. "You shouldn't see people that way." Rin tilted his head slightly, watching him. "Why not?" Jiro exhaled sharply, eyes squeezing shut. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Because no one's ever seen me that way before." The words came out wrecked, raw in a way that Rin had never heard before. Jiro swayed slightly where he stood, like the weight of those words had stolen whatever was left of his strength. He pressed both hands against the counter, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. Rin hesitated. Then, without thinking, he reached out. His fingers curled around Jiro's wrist, gentle but steady, a quiet, grounding touch. Jiro didn't move, didn't pull away. He just stood there, trembling under Rin's touch, finally letting himself feel the weight of everything he had spent his entire life running from. And Rin didn't say anything. He just held on. Jiro didn't talk about what happened. Not that day, not the next, maybe not ever. But Rin didn't need him to, because everything had changed. The sharp edges of Jiro's presence were gone. He wasn't cruel anymore, wasn't mocking. But more than that, he was different in ways that couldn't be ignored. When Mr. Tano barked orders, Jiro actually listened. When the kitchen got overwhelmed, he stepped in without being asked. And when customers muttered something under their breath about hiring better workers, he didn't let it slide. But Rin noticed other things too. Like how Jiro always seemed to be nearby when Rin worked, not hovering, not overbearing, just there. As if without thinking, he had become someone who looked out for him. And then, one evening, Jiro did something that neither of them knew how to talk about. It was after closing. The lamps were dim, the doors locked. Rin had just finished wiping down the last table when he felt a presence behind him. He turned and found Jiro standing there, holding something out to him. A brand new sketchbook. Rin's ears flicked up in surprise. His tail curled slightly behind him. "What's this?" Jiro looked vaguely uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "Figured you were almost out of pages." Rin blinked, then slowly, carefully, took the sketchbook from Jiro's hands. The weight of it felt solid, real. Jiro shoved his hands into his pockets, glancing away. "Don't read into it," he muttered. "Just seemed like you needed a new one." Rin ran his fingers over the cover. His chest felt tight in a way he didn't fully understand. Then, after a pause, he said softly, "Thank you." Jiro exhaled, scrubbed a hand through his hair. Didn't quite meet Rin's eyes. "Yeah," he muttered. And somehow that was enough. The teahouse was empty. The last of the chairs had been stacked, the counters wiped clean. The lamps cast a warm, flickering glow over the quiet space, making it feel smaller, softer, like a place that didn't belong to the rest of the world anymore. Jiro was still here. Rin wasn't sure why. He had finished closing up, had already put his things away, but Jiro hadn't left. He lingered by the counter, absently turning a stray teaspoon between his fingers, gaze unfocused. Rin watched him for a moment, tail curling slightly behind him. Then, without really thinking, he said, "Do you like working here?" Jiro blinked, caught off guard. What? Rin shrugged. You could leave, you know. Get a different job. You don't have to stay. Jiro let out a short, breathy laugh. Yeah, I know. But he didn't say more. Rin didn't press him. He just walked over, taking a seat at the counter. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. Not anymore. Then finally, Jiro exhaled. You ever thought about leaving? Rin tilted his head. Leaving where? Jiro gestured vaguely around them. This place. The city. Rin considered that. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe someday. But I don't really have anywhere else to go. Jiro was quiet for a moment. Then almost hesitantly, he muttered, If you did, where would it be? Rin's ears flicked up slightly. A small, knowing smile tugged at his lips. That's what the sketchbook is for. Jiro huffed a soft laugh, shaking his head. Of course it is. The quiet settled again. It wasn't heavy. Just still. And then in a voice so low Rin almost didn't hear it, Jiro said, Guess I'll stick around a little longer. Rin didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Because this time, Jiro wasn't saying it like an obligation. He was saying it like a choice. The lamps flickered. Outside, the city murmured in the distance. But in here, the world felt smaller, simpler. Like, maybe for the first time, this place wasn't just somewhere to exist, but somewhere to stay. And somehow, that was enough.